its peak, the British Empire controlled over 35.5 million square kilometers, or about 13.7 million square miles, about 26% of Earth's landmass. It was the largest empire that the world had ever seen. But behind the red-coated soldiers and royal proclamations was something far more unexpected: a corporation. The British East India Company wasn't just a trading outfit, but a global force. Armed with a private army and backed by the crown, it conquered territories, collected taxes, and even sparked rebellions. For over 250 years, it blurred the lines between business and empire. So how did a group of merchants gain the power to rule over millions? And what led to the downfall of one of history's most dangerous companies? Let's go. In the late 16th century, England was a rising naval power, but they were far behind the Dutch and Portuguese when it came to overseas trading. The spices, silk, cotton, and tea of Asia were in high demand in Europe, and whoever controlled these trade routes controlled immense wealth. So in 1600, Queen Elizabeth I signed a royal charter, granting a group of English merchants the exclusive right to trade with the East. The company they formed was known as the following: the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading in the East Indies. Yeah, quite a mouthful, but history will remember it by a much simpler name: the British East India Company. Now its goal, of course, was straightforward: get rich by importing exotic goods from Asia. But doing so was no easy task. The voyages were long, dangerous, and incredibly expensive. Ships could take 2 years round trip, facing piracy, disease, and monsoons. But the potential profits were staggering. The company's first voyage brought back pepper and returned massive profits, often cited at 200 to 300%. Now that kind of return turns heads. The company started with small trading outposts, factories, in places like Sutra, Madras, and Bombay, and over time, these ports became strategic footholds. But trade alone wasn't enough to compete. The company began fortifying their positions, recruiting private militias, and leveraging local politics to protect their interests. Slowly but surely, the seeds of empire was starting to be planted. By the 18th century, the British East India Company was no longer just a merchant group. It was a political and military machine. The real turning point came in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey. Here's the setup. The Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, had grown suspicious of British ambition and attacked their base in Calcutta. In retaliation, Robert Clive, a company officer, led a force to confront him. Clive struck a secret deal with discontented Indian elites, bribing them to betray the Nawab mid-battle. And the result? A swift British victory and control of Bengal, one of the wealthiest provinces in the world at the time. Now, overnight, the East India Company went from merchants to tax collectors for millions of people. They called it dual government, where Indian rulers appeared in charge, but the real power sat with the company. They extracted massive revenue, forcing farmers and local rulers to pay tribute while exporting the wealth back to London. And to enforce their rule, the company built one of the largest private armies in the world, mostly composed of Indian soldiers known as sepoys, trained in European-style warfare. Now, this army was bigger than many national militaries, and by 1803, it had over 200,000 troops, more than double the size of the British Army. By the 1800s, the East India Company had become a state within a state. It minted its own currency, administered British laws, and ran vast bureaucracies across India. And at the heart of it all was profit. But we can't forget about the tea. The company's monopoly on tea, it wasn't just profitable, but it was political. In the American colonies, the company's tax-free tea was seen as a symbol of British overreach. Colonists were furious that a private company was allowed to flood the market. That fury boiled over in 1773 with the Boston Tea Party, when American patriots boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped over 90,000 pounds of company tea into the sea. And that moment, well, it helped spark and ignite the American Revolution. But that's another video. Back in India, the effects were far worse. In 1770 in Bengal, there was a massive, devastating famine. Company tax collectors seized grain at gunpoint. Villagers who wouldn't pay were whipped, jailed, or had their land confiscated. And in some regions, peasants were forced to grow indigo or opium instead of food, leaving entire communities on the edge of starvation. Roughly 10 million people died, and company officials had ignored the crisis, continuing to collect taxes and ship grain to Europe. Many historians argue that the famine wasn't just a natural disaster, but it was manufactured by corporate greed. So, while millions starved, the company's shareholders received record dividends. And in China, the company's thirst for profit led to something even darker. because China didn't want much from Britain, and the trade was lopsided. So in order to fix this, the company pushed a new product: opium, grown in India and smuggled into China. When Chinese officials begged Britain to stop, the company pushed harder, sparking the Opium Wars that forced China to submit at gunpoint. The company proved that in its empire, profit came before human life. By the mid-19th century, the company's control over India was becoming shaky, and its own sepoy troops were angry, disrespected, underpaid, and fighting far from home. But the final spark came in 1857. Now, soldiers were issued the new Enfield rifles, but rumors started to spread that cartridges were greased with beef and pork fat, offensive to both Hindus and Muslims. But what made it even worse was that soldiers were required to bite the cartridge to open it. Now, that single detail, biting the cartridge, was enough to set off a full-blown rebellion. It began in Meerut and spread across northern India. British officers were killed, company outposts were burned, and the Mughal emperor was briefly restored as a symbolic ruler. And this was no small mutiny. It was the largest anti-colonial uprising of the 19th century. But the British responded with overwhelming brutality, raze entire villages, execute thousands, but something especially cruel that they did was tie rebels to cannons and blow them apart in public. Now, in the aftermath, the British Parliament blamed the company for the chaos. So in 1858, the British Parliament transferred the British East India Company's administrative powers and territories to the British Crown. This ended the company's control over India and ushered in the British Raj. Later on, the company would be formally dissolved by the East India Stock Dividend Redemption Act of 1873, and then final dissolution occurred on June 1st, 1874. The British East India Company lasted for 258 years, and in that time it reshaped the world. It brought foreign goods to Europe, helped build the British economy, it modernized trade infrastructure, building ports and roads and shipping networks that later became the backbone of global trade routes, and it helped create the global tea economy. But it also forcefully opened China to British trade by the Opium Wars, exploited Indian resources and labor, caused famine, violence, and mass death, causing cultural and economic disruption, and also pushed the dangerous idea that profits can even justify death and destruction. The British East India Company ruled millions, sparked revolutions, expanded global trade, and changed the course of history. It also showed us what happens when unchecked capitalism is given the power of a nation. So what do you think? Was the company a brilliant engine of commerce or a disgusting corporate monster? Let me know in the comments down below. And until then, I'm Evan, and thanks for watching. If you liked what you just saw, then click on the video here. Also, if you haven't, like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any future videos.